Hi, everybody. Hopefully, you can hear me well. I wanted to make a video called Does Language Define Culture for a while now. I wanted to make a proper video, but my computer, I don't know how to make videos on my computer anymore. That's also why I don't make so many videos because uh, stuff is blocked. I mean, my computer, it can't save videos anymore or something like that. It can, but I don't know. I need to fix it. So anyway, I wanted to make a video called Does Language Define Culture? And what I mean by this is is language a filter for what we know as our culture today? Now, this is actually a kind of important topic to me, and I wanted to make this video for a long time, but I didn't do it. I didn't even prepare for it properly today or so, but I'm gonna make it live first, and then maybe later on I will make a better video on this. Maybe somebody will comment on this video or so and give me more ideas on this. But yeah, so here goes. Where the topic came from is I was talking to a friend, and somehow the topic of sort of racism or discrimination or stuff came up. Like, is there racism in Europe or discrimination or something like this? Came up and and then she said, it's not a close friend or anything, but it's just somebody who I was working with, right? Because sometimes I volunteer at a place near my home, and she's also a volunteer there. So I was talking to her, and she said, what she said, I know somebody, I was doing kickboxing class with him, whatever, and he said, and he's a white guy, and he says to me, "Oh, I'm an African. I'm a white African," and yeah, he loves being a white African. So I guess he also probably, because he grew up in Africa, he also faced discrimination, but he's proud to be an African. He loves being an African. He's a white African, blah blah blah. And then I spoke to her, and I was like, yeah, okay, he probably faces some discrimination as well because he sees himself as an African, but maybe people don't see him as an African, and so on and so on. Gianna, please, I'm making a video. Yeah. So, Gianna, give me 2 minutes now, please. Yeah. Okay. So I spoke to her and I said, okay, that's all good, blah blah. But later I thought about it and I wanted to ask her, what language was he speaking? He was speaking to her in English, of course, right? And so, okay, this brings me back to the concept of language being a filter. Okay, so how do I explain this? I don't know how to explain it very well, but we grow up and we are molded, and every day we have input. We have input from our teachers, we have input from the things that we read, we have input from the books that we read, we have input from the movies that we look at, the stories that we're told, and all of this input creates ideas in our head, and it sort of forms who we are, how we see the world, what we see as right and wrong, what we see as how we see the world. And it also creates an important concept of a cultural story. So as we grow up and we learn things and we get all of the input, everything that we learn as we read a book, Macbeth, as we read Shakespeare, as we read Jane Austen stories, all of these things, what happens in Jane Austen stories, how it goes, how do people get married or whatever, the movies that we look at show us that everybody has a living room and a bedroom and a this, and that's how people live, and that's the way to live. So then we aspire to have those things. We aspire to live like that. And we have a culture, and we also have what I would call a really important concept of a cultural story, how we believe the world works, how we believe history was, what we believe, what we believe is right and wrong and stuff like this, right? Now, the cultural stories, all of the input come through whatever language we speak, right? So let's say you're English speaking and that is all you speak. The cultural input that you get is all from English speaking culture. Let's say you speak 2 or 3 languages, then the cultural input that you get is all from these 3 languages, right? And therefore, the ideas would tend to be, since everybody from who speaks English is exposed to these movies, so these ideas tend to be somehow similar and whatever, and ideas that might be present in completely in other cultures may not ever enter your realm. They may not ever enter your mind. They may not ever be posed to you. So then these ideas that maybe in other cultures are not as prominent, you know. So in English speaking culture, right? English speaking culture is, of course, dominated by the majority of English speakers. The majority of English speakers probably come from a white, from European lineage or something like that. The majority of English speakers are whoever they are. Maybe they're American, maybe they're British. I don't know who they are, but I mean, well, you could calculate. But the point is, the average English speaker looks a certain way and is of European heritage, right? So English speaking culture tends to center white people, right? So therefore, so English speaking culture has a cultural story which, one, centers white people, and two, views them as normal or whatever, good, whatever. And this cultural story, whatever it is the product accumulation of thousands and thousands of years. It's not like just something that happens like this. I mean, it's like whatever entered English speaking culture, these things, it happened over a very long period of time. Of course, it can totally change, and it is changing every day, and it will change for sure. In 100 years, it may be nothing like it is today. That is no problem, and that is how it is. But the point is, right now, there's still the accumulation of history, the hundreds or thousands of years that came before, and today, what the average person who speaks English is like, or what, you know. And English speaking culture in particular is a really bad language to use, because English is a language that is international right now, and everybody speaks English and people speak it as a second language. So English gets a lot of input from other cultures, but I'm using it because I'm talking to you in English and that's the language I speak. So what I want to say, Jess, is I want to talk about this concept of cultures having, first of all, a cultural story, where we talk about who belongs in this culture, how this culture came to be, who created it, who dominates it, who has a right to be here, and who has earned the right to be within this culture. This sort of, or a cultural story about who is good and who is bad, and what is, you know, who is at the center of the story. And the idea that language might be something that limits or filters ideas, so that in every language there are similar cultural stories and similar ideas on life and stuff like that. And so English speaking culture centers certain people. And this, the reason why it's so important to me, is because I think it's a really important thing to people who have entered cultures late, who are minorities, who are not centered within the cultures that they have entered, and who do not have another language. And so it somehow makes language very important to teach your children, even, I mean, when you enter a culture. Okay, so it somehow links back to bilingualism and stuff like that, because what is happening is okay, so what I want to say, okay, so take my ancestry, right? I'm from the Caribbean and I am Black. So my ancestors probably came to the Caribbean via slavery and so on and so on. They came to the Caribbean via slavery, and that's how, right? Okay, so okay, and in the Caribbean, we also have people of East Indian descent. We have people of Chinese, of every descent, but we're taking East Indian people or Black people, right? We're just looking at these groups. So an Indian person or an East Indian person who lives in the Caribbean, who lives in Trinidad and Tobago or Guyana or something like that, they speak English. They only speak English. The only language that they have is English, right? But English-speaking culture, because Indians are such a minority, they are never actually centered within English-speaking culture. So none of the movies are about them. None of the fairy tales are about them. None of these things are about them. They are really hardly ever seen or centered. And there are only so many movies that are about them. They don't get to see themselves. They don't have that advantage of seeing themselves. So an Indian person who speaks only English is never centered, and they live their entire life without ever being centered or without ever seeing themselves as at the center of society. And that could be quite difficult, I think, for the individual, because as they grow up and they start to then question, do they really belong in this culture? Because the culture, when it centers certain groups, it basically says that this group created everything. You know, that the people at the center are the creators, are the owners, are the protectors of the culture. They are the ones who they have created all of the ideas, all of the way we live, the structure of society, and so on. And so someone who is of Indian descent or Black or whatever, they don't get to see themselves as having contributed to that. They haven't contributed to the culture because the cultural story doesn't allow them. And that's where like things like cultural appropriation come into place and stuff like that. And that's why cultural appropriation is so important. I have made videos in the past, maybe 5 years ago or whatever, and I have I spoke about cultural appropriation, and I laughed at people who agreed with cultural appropriation, and I was wrong. Like, I admit that I was wrong. So I've changed my mind and stuff like that, and I understand now why it's important, why they make this big deal out of cultural appropriation and stuff. I still don't agree with the way in which it's done, but I understand why it is important and why they make a big deal out of it. Because what they're saying is that the minorities, the people like who are Indian, who are African or whatever, who are Black or Indian or whatever, within the society, with cultural appropriation, what happens is that the majority basically steals their culture or parts of their culture that they find attractive, and they take ownership of it, and the person misses out on being able to believe that they contributed to the society or that they belong in the society. And so what we have in English speaking culture, why I have a lot of fighting about racism and is because we have a problem where the majority exists and has the advantage because of historical reasons and because they have been within the culture for the longest. They have this centering, the culture centers around them, and they are the majority, so of course it would center around them. And there's no opportunity for the minorities to ever live within a society where they are ever centered, or where their contribution to the society or the idea that they actually belong is acknowledged. It's not acknowledged because the cultural story that we have within our language culture, language bound culture, doesn't give doesn't admit that. It doesn't give the story that they exist or that they contributed or that they have a right to be here. And that was the problem for a long time. And that's why I have so much discussion about racism and stuff like that, why it's somehow changing, you know? So yeah, I think that it's really an important discussion. Can language define culture? I know that it can't. I know that you have many subcultures within the English speaking culture. I know that you have many subcultures, and no language actually defines a culture. I understand that. But I do believe that language can act as a filter, and that people who speak the same language, at least you have access. So it's like at least to the end of that point, there's no input that you would ever receive outside of your language. But at least if someone speaks your language, they can create input that you will receive, and therefore they can affect how you see the world and your culture. And so what you have is that English speaking culture is dominated by certain people, Americans or whatever. And I'm not going to say it's only white people or whatever. There are other groups that are also very prominent within English speaking culture. It's not only one group, or it's not only British people, it's also Americans or whatever. But the point is that these groups are the majorities. And there are other people who exist within English speaking culture who are minorities within that culture and who never ever get to see themselves centered. And this creates a problem for those individuals where they feel as though they don't actually have a culture because they don't have any culture that one centers them. They don't have access to a culture that centers them because they don't speak a language which of that such a culture, and they feel as though they don't have a place where they have contributed to or where they actually belong. Which is why, if I were to bring it back to the conversation of bilingualism and stuff like that, it's quite important for people who, let's say, an Indian person who moves to America and their children become American or whatever, and they try and speak English. It's important for that person to also try to transfer the language so that their child could live a little bit within two cultures, so that their child could have some of Indian culture, which would be a culture that, of course, centers them, and so on and so on. And I don't think bilingualism is like a magic trick that actually works, because once you move to a place and live in a culture and stuff, you don't really have a choice but to find a way to belong to that culture. And also, I also don't really even agree with the concept of learning a language or whatever. I think languages are lived, and the process by which your brain learns languages is extremely complicated and not something that we should try to control or force or whatever. I think it's like, for example, my kids have a lot of language issues. I don't know how to describe that. I also do. But I don't really care about my language issues, because at least I speak English, so that's good enough for me. But based on how you grow up, when you live within certain languages are acquired, not learned. That's the best way that I want to put it. I believe in the acquisition of language, not really the learning of language. So I think it's very hard for a child who is Chinese or Asian or Indian or whatever, who grows up in America, to try and learn Mandarin and be expected to be good at it. And I think that is like, yeah, it's okay to do. I'm not bashing any parents, but it's not something that I see as good, because you have to live within a language in order to really, for it to make sense and for it to be learned properly or in a good way, I think. I mean, and for it to not be something that you resent and hate and all of that. So, but it's still important from a cultural perspective for children who are members of minority groups to have access to cultures that center them. And language, in this sense, is the only path that they have to have access to those cultures. So in that sense, I think language does affect or sort of bound culture. And I think it's a really important discussion to discuss. Is language somehow a filter which determines your culture? And how do you feel as an individual living within a culture, within a language where you are not centered, where you are seen as other, where you are seen as a minority, where you are seen as a newcomer, where you're seen as someone who didn't contribute to the culture, you're seen as someone who is not historically relevant or doesn't have any history or place within the culture. I think this is a really difficult thing for the individual, and I think this is how and why the whole discussions of cultural appropriation come in, and why it's actually quite important to discuss it, and to see how you could find a way around it, how cultures could somehow open up to discussion that minorities have contributed historically and otherwise, because they have, but it's not seen within the cultural story that we have, within the average cultural story, within the accumulation of all of the input, because so much of the input is historical, and so much of the input is historical and present and dominated by groups that actually don't believe that minorities have contributed, and so on and so on and so on. And so, yeah, you have these problems. Okay, and on to discussions on updates on what is going on with my life. So I am in the Netherlands right now. We got the house in Belgium, and I did make one long video showing a house tour, but then I took it down because it had too much information in it, I think. And yeah, the house is very nice. I'm looking forward to moving. I mean, it's very old and crappy to anybody who sees it. Actually, it looks really old and crappy, and everything is wrong with it. We need to fix the electrics, the heating, the everything. We need to renovate everything. But the house is really nice to me. I really like it. I like the area. I like everything. I'm looking forward to moving. I hope that I won't be really bored there, but I know that when everything settles, I'll have a lot of time there because, I mean, like, I hope so. And we are in the process of selling the place that we had initially bought as our first home here in the Netherlands, and I hope that everything goes well. The housing market is very interesting. It's supposedly booming, but yeah, I'm also very much into economics. I listen to a lot of Peter Schiff and stuff like that. Not that I believe what Peter Schiff says. I just like to listen to it. I think he's a very good speaker. He speaks very well, and so far, although he's kind of conservative, he hasn't said anything really hurtful or so. So I kind of respect his middle ground area in that he's like he's Jewish and he's very conservative and he doesn't agree with anything like affirmative action and he thinks liberals are a bit crazy and stuff, but he somehow manages to not really insult people. And so I like that he's able to speak in a way that toes the line. Like he can give his views without actually saying anything insulting or racist or mean or whatever, you know. So he I listen to him. So yeah, I find everything with the economy very interesting. I don't know how long the housing market will continue to boom, or if everything will just inflate a lot because they printed a lot of money, or if things will calm down or whatever. Here in Europe, I see that there's quite a lot of weather change and that the climate, like we are in November and it is super sunny outside. I have Okay, here's a mess, but you see how sunny and everything is. It's really sunny and bright, and it looks like we're in the middle of the summer, which is crazy. So, and it's November. I don't know if it's just that the winter is moving to another month or something, but it still looks like summer weather. Yes, the trees are losing leaves, so fall has started, but it's still really good weather for Europe. I think when I first came to Europe, it was much worse. So, um, yeah. Um, what else? So yeah, everything is okay. I'm not really bored anymore. I was bored before, but I'm not really bored because now we have the house and I'm busy trying to organize everything so that we could renovate and so that we could fix it. But I'm like, as I get closer and do everything, it's kind of like I'm not really renovating right now. I think like I should, but I am a bit nervous. I don't know why, but I think I want to live there first, even in the chaos in a sense for a while, and then renovate and do it properly or slowly and not overspend and not be in a rush to get everything done and not create too much crazy. I don't know. And I want to do it slowly and do every room at a time. So it will take us a really long time to renovate. And also we need to find the right people to do the big, heavy work. So yeah. So that is it with us. I'm looking forward to moving soon. And yeah, we still haven't figured out a lot of things. And hopefully I'll be able to make more videos once I figure out how to make videos again. My computer doesn't really allow me to save videos on the computer anymore because it's full. And even though I try to delete things, I don't know how to get it to be not full, and I don't want to delete the stuff that I have on my computer because I think I use it. So that's why I don't make so many videos anymore. But one day I'll figure it out once I have a lot of time. I'm busy decorating and buying a lot of stuff. I almost everything that I buy or that I bought so far for the house has been secondhand. So I'm really trying to buy most of the things secondhand. I look at what I want even in IKEA or in the different shops, and then I look for it online secondhand, and then I usually always find it. But secondhand buying has its challenges as well because sometimes people don't take care of the items and then they still sell it. or it's also very far to go and pick up things and stuff like that. But the items are always cheaper, and I think it's better for the environment and stuff like that to not buy new. Although I don't know if that's just an excuse to be cheap or whatever, but yeah. So I'm looking for everything secondhand, and I'm busy sort of designing and decorating, which is quite fun. And I'm crazily buying furniture, even though I haven't renovated. Gonna put the furniture in place and going to live in it as it is basically, and then slowly I'm going to renovate each room, um, one by one, room by room, and make the house hopefully good and useful, and monetize it. So yeah, that's it for this video. It would be interesting to hear your ideas um, on what I said, especially in the beginning of the video. What are your ideas on language as a limitation for culture? And do you agree that languages tend to have like an influence over our culture or over the individual's culture, and that languages have tend to have common cultural stories which center different people, and that it can be difficult for someone with one uh, background, or who is different, who is not centered within a culture, to be in such a culture that where they are not centered. Is that a thing? Is that something that is happening? And yeah. Um, so yeah, that's the end of this stream. Thanks for listening and have a good day. Bye. Mhm.